In an election in which polls have clearly and unmistakably reflected that the number one concern of Americans when going to the polls is that their family lack economic security, that they are suffering from increasing food prices that often makes it difficult even to be able to buy groceries, their kids don't have health care, their communities are ravaged by fentanyl, and the US government seems to care less and less about the lives of all of them other than a tiny handful, a sliver of people in Washington who are there to make money and feed off the system, what Donald Trump in 2016 so successfully railed against as the DC swamp. And that's why it has always been amazing, given that perception, which is clearly accurate, that our towns in the industrial Midwest have been gutted by free trade, as a lot of people predicted under Bill Clinton, as people's livelihood has been destroyed by the financial crisis and then by COVID, as wealth and income inequality have risen more than ever before to the point where the middle class is all but destroyed, or people are barely hanging on to middle class life, where the American dream of passing on a better life to your kids is increasingly precarious. This is something that is not even in doubt, that this is what the vast majority of Americans think. And yet over the last year, the last 2 years, the primary policy of the Biden administration has been to just take tens and then hundreds of billions of dollars and send them overseas. This is American taxpayer money, money that the United States government has, and they've not been using it to solve any of those problems that Americans in large numbers are saying are burdening their lives and making them angry. But instead, they're just sending it overseas to Ukraine or to Israel to pay for their wars, to fund these wars that have no effect whatsoever on the lives of American citizens, except that these endless war and the military-industrial complex that benefits from it continue to grow. Now, you would think that in the wake of that stinging defeat that the Democrats just suffered, primarily due to the perception I just laid out, that they would at least pay lip service to the idea that they heard that message, that they're interested in changing their policies. And yet, 1 week after the election, just a little bit over 1 week, the U.S. Secretary of State for Joe Biden, Anthony Blinken, stood up today, and he's been under a lot of pressure by the media saying, look, Donald Trump seems like he wants to get into office and finally end the war in Ukraine. This endless, senseless, destructive, bloody war that has cost the United States $150 billion or more, that has killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russians, that the Russians are winning, that has destroyed Ukraine, that will inevitably end, and exactly the sort of Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory that could have been averted at the beginning through a kind of an agreement that Russia and Ukraine were headed to until Boris Johnson and the United States government intervened and said, we don't want you to diplomatically resolve the war. We want this war to continue for our own interest. And here's what Blinken said after hearing that message that I just laid out about the election. This is what he announced.
As we're working to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself, the United States continues to step up. We've obligated just recently and pushed out the door another $8 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. That was in September.
So he's boasting here. Look, we just pushed out the door another $8 billion 2 months before the election. We pushed that out the door, meaning we took it from the Treasury and we gave it to Kiev, a country drowning in corruption that has no accountability in terms of how that money is spent. So he's boasting, look, we're doing a lot. We just took this $8 billion on top of the $150 billion we already pushed out, quote unquote, meaning pushed from our home, from our country to that country. And then here's what he says they're going to do until Joe Biden leaves office.
They're almost $500 million just a few weeks ago. And President Biden is committed to making sure that every dollar we have at our disposal will be pushed out the door between now and January 20th.
That's the message to the American people. We heard your message. We got booted out of office. You're extremely angry at our indifference to your interests. And we want you to know that in response to that message, what we're going to do is we are going to take every available dollar we can find and send it over to Ukraine. Now, in one sense, I understand that it really is part of Joe Biden's legacy and the legacy of NATO that they painted themselves into the corner by saying that we cannot allow Russia to take even 1 inch of Ukrainian land. That any resolution to this war that resulted in Russia winning any part of Ukraine, or even letting them keep Crimea, which they had a referendum and annexed in 2014 because the people of Crimea view themselves as Russia as a response to the coup that we helped engineer in Kiev, that even allowing them to keep Crimea would be a defeat to Russia, which we cannot allow under any circumstances. So they created this goal of this war that was always impossible. The Russians would absolutely use nuclear weapons rather than give up Crimea to NATO, especially given how much NATO has now been involving itself in Ukraine. And nobody thinks, even Zelensky, even Kiev, even European capitals are admitting that the only possible outcome for this war is to give Russia parts of Ukraine to allow them to occupy it as a buffer and to ensure that NATO will never include Ukraine, or at least for a long time. Putin has won the war. There's no expulsion of Russian troops. And yet the West simply cannot admit reality. And so what they're trying to do is to increase the war and escalate it as much as possible in this futile hope that it will somehow improve the Ukrainians' negotiating position. So here is what Joe Biden is doing in what the New York Times calls, quote, his swan song. No legislation to help the American people, but instead, quote, a diplomatic trip overshadowed by President Trump's victory. President Biden will attend global summits in Peru and Brazil as world leaders prepare for the return of Donald Trump's, quote, isolationist foreign policy. The week's 2 summits in Lima and Rio de Janeiro will not be the reaffirmation that Mr. Biden has wanted of a foreign policy legacy built during a career in Congress and the White House. Rather, the gatherings will be a kind of elegy for a bygone era that defined American foreign policy for most of the president's life. Quote, he's not in a position to reassure people about U.S. foreign policy after January 20th, so it's not his to predict or his to guarantee, said Richard Haass, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Haass said the trip represents, quote, a bridge between two very different conceptions of America's role in the world. Aides to the president say he is determined to keep pursuing that agenda until his last moment in office. This agenda that has been so destructive, that the United States is going to rule the world with military force, that we're going to dictate who runs what country and what part of the world, that has bankrupted the United States, that has destroyed the American homeland and the people who live in it, that has killed immense numbers of people, and that the United States isn't even capable of achieving anymore. The article goes on, quote, in Rio, Mr. Biden will have his last global opportunity to make the case for Ukraine and to champion the alliances he has advocated during his term. Mr. Trump and many of the Republican allies on Capitol Hill have made it clear that they have no more patience for the billions of dollars in financial support that has been sent to Ukraine in the last 2 years. Mr. Biden is likely to try and reassure the other leaders that the United States will find a way to continue to help Ukraine, even with Mr. Trump at the helm next year. What is Biden going to do? Get one of those little machines while he's at the beach in Rehoboth that detects coins and send them over to Ukraine? This war is over. This war is over. The only question left is how many people NATO is going to allow to be killed, send weapons to be killed, how much more of Ukraine is going to be destroyed. But the outcome is something that everybody understands, which is that Russia will gain a buffer zone between it and the West, will not allow Ukraine to expand up to that most sensitive part of its border, and that the provinces in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine that regard themselves as Russian, who have been waging a civil war, since 2014 to gain some sort of autonomy, will be under Russian control and not the control of Kiev. That is the reality. Ukraine will be left as a rump country. You may not like that, you may not wish it were true, but that's just the reality of it. It's been the reality for at least a year that NATO and Biden have just refused to accept in pursuit of this fairy tale that does not exist. Here's the New York Times yesterday, quote, Ukraine prioritizes security, not territory, as Trump pushes truce talks, meaning even Ukraine has now accepted the idea that they're going to have to give up what had been Ukrainian soil in order to get this war over. Quote, discussions over a potential settlement have heated up since the election last week of Mr. Trump, who has vowed to press for immediate talks. That's a shift from the Biden administration's longtime position that the timing in terms of any settlement should be left to Ukraine. Mr. Trump has been openly skeptical about continuing American aid to Ukraine and has said he can bring about an end to the war in one day without saying how. Perhaps the most detailed clue of Mr. Trump's views came in a July interview with Fox News. Quote, "I would tell Zelensky, no more, you've got to make a deal," Mr. Trump said of President Zelensky of Ukraine. "I would tell Putin, if you don't make a deal, we're going to give him a lot." Mr. Trump and Mr. Zelensky spoke last week, but neither side made public what has been discussed. Now, one of the things that we've had Professor Mearsheimer on our show before to emphasize is that Trump can go to Russia all he wants and say, if you don't do a deal of the kind we want, we're going to give a lot to Ukraine. That's what the West has been doing for 2.5 years. Putin doesn't care about that. Putin doesn't seem in any rush to end this war. He'd be more than happy to continue to expand the war. And I don't think anyone thinks or takes seriously Trump's threat that he would involve American forces in Ukraine or anything like that. The Russians believe that the United States and NATO provoked this war and fueled this war. They had endured a very heavy cost for it. And the only deal they're going to accept is one that they believe is fully within their national interest to protect what they perceive as their national security, which is NATO's incursions into and control over Ukraine, which they simply won't accept. But I do think that Trump's desire, not to say we're going to keep pouring every dollar we can find into Ukraine, as Blinken said today, but instead to say we need to do everything we can to bring an end to this war, is absolutely the correct one. Not just because this war has been immensely costly, but because having the United States and Russia, the two largest nuclear powers on opposite sides of a proxy war, is unbelievably dangerous. To say nothing of the cost to the United States and to American citizens, to our inability to focus elsewhere in the world. All the way back in August of 2023, which is a year and a half ago, CNN published this poll that read, quote, "Majority of Americans now oppose more U.S. aid for Ukraine in the war with Russia." Quote, "Most Americans oppose Congress authorizing additional funding to support the Ukraine in its war with Russia," according to a new CNN poll conducted by SSRS, as the public splits over whether the U.S. has already done enough to assist Ukraine. Overall, 55% say the U.S. should not authorize additional funding to support Ukraine, versus 45% who say Congress should authorize such funding. And 51% say that the United States has already done enough to help Ukraine, while 48% say it should do more. A poll conducted in the early days of the Russian invasion in February 22 found 62% who felt the U.S. should have been doing more. Partisan divisions have widened since that poll too, with most Democrats and Republicans now on opposing sides of questions on the U.S. role in Ukraine. So clearly in the West and throughout the United States, there is a recognition that this war has to come to an end, and I vastly prefer President Trump's insistence that this war end, that we can't fund it forever, and many of his top national security appointees have said the same, to what had been Joe Biden's vow that we will support Ukraine for as long as we have to, a vow that very subtly changed to we will support Ukraine for as long as we can. Russia won the war, NATO and the United States lost the war, and there's no changing that, and it's time for that to be accepted. Here from the Council on Foreign Relations, September of 2024, so just a couple months ago. Title, how much U.S. aid is going to Ukraine? Quote, "Since the war began, the U.S. Congress has voted through 5 bills that have provided Ukraine with ongoing aid, doing so most recently in April 2024. The total budget authority under these bills," the quote, headline figure often is cited by news media, is $175 billion. Now, part of the $8 billion that Blinken referred to might be part of that authorization that they're just drawing down, but that's a huge amount of money. It's over 80 billion, 180 billion now, on top of what the Europeans have given. And nobody believes this war is being won by anybody but Russia. Here's The Economist, which has been a very vocal supporter of NATO, of the U.S. and NATO financing of Ukraine, and they have been, to their credit, quite candid about how destructive this war has been to Ukraine. Here from The Economist, Ukraine is now struggling to cling on, not to win. Russia is slicing through Ukrainian defenses and parts of the battlefield. Do you remember a year and a half ago when I used to have Professor Sachs on and Professor Mearsheimer on? I mean, I still do, but to talk about the war in Ukraine, or when I would just talk about it by myself, anybody who suggested what was so obvious, which is that Russia would inevitably win the war just on sheer size alone, in a war of attrition, was called a Russian agent, was trying to sell Kremlin down the river. It was just reality that the West didn't want to accept. And as a result, hundreds of millions, thousands of people have needlessly died. To say nothing of the drain on American resources. Here from NBC News, in an exit poll November 5th of the 2024 election, quote, voters expressed deep concern about America's democracy and economy. Quote, women are twice as likely as men to rank abortion as their top issue, according to preliminary results. Asked to choose among 5 issues, 34% of voters said democracy mattered most to their votes, while 31% said the economy. Abortion and immigration ranked as the next most important, while just 4% named foreign policy. There have been other exit polls that show that different, that show the economy first, and even among people who say democracy is their concern, something like half of them voted for Trump. They believe it's Democrats undermining democracy in all sorts of ways, including by weaponizing the justice system against their political opponents. But if you think Americans wake up and on the top 10 of their concerns is whether Russia or Ukraine will rule the Donbass, you're living in a fantasy world. And so when Blinken stands up and says, we just sent another $8 billion out the door to Ukraine, and we're going to get every dollar we can to shove out the door before we leave. If Democrats are still confused about what they lost, all they have to do is listen to what Blinken said today, and everything ought to be clear. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.